Winston Gray walked into the lobby in a $3,000 suit, and the receptionist told him deliveries go through the back. 5 minutes later, the entire executive board was fired by him. They thought he was the driver, but he owned the company. What they didn't know, he recorded everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind him, sealing off the sounds of the city, and replacing them with the cold sterility of corporate air. Winston Gray stood still for a moment, letting the silence stretch around him like fabric. He was a tall man, mid-40s, with skin the color of mahogany, and eyes carved from determination. Every line on his tailored suit spoke of success, not showmanship. Italian wool, navy blue, cut to precision. His polished Oxfords struck the marble floor with quiet certainty as he walked in. Behind the sleek front desk, the young white receptionist barely glanced up from her phone. Her gum popped as she lazily looked toward him. There was no warmth in her eyes, just a flicker of misrecognition, then dismissal. "Can I help you?" she asked, already reaching for the clipboard meant for carriers and drivers. Winston's voice was smooth but clipped. "I have a 10,000 a.m. meeting." She gestured toward a small bench near the wall without bothering to ask his name. "You can wait there. We're not accepting drop-offs at the conference room. Deliveries go through the back." For a moment, Winston didn't move. His eyes flicked to the company logo behind her, Colton Technologies. Beneath it, a shining plaque read, "Innovation through Inclusion." He nodded once, as if taking mental notes, and walked slowly to the bench she indicated. It was low, uncomfortable, the kind placed deliberately to keep people like him invisible. He sat down, placed his phone on his knee, and waited. From the glass partition behind her desk, he could see part of the break room. Inside, 3 employees laughed loudly. One, a man with sandy blonde hair and a smirk that said he had never been corrected in his life, sipped coffee and pointed toward the lobby. "Did you see that? Who let security get so relaxed?" he joked. "Looks like someone's Uber driver wandered in." The others chuckled. One of them, a woman in business attire, murmured, "Maybe DoorDash. I'm starving." Winston didn't blink. He simply let the moment embed itself in his memory. Moments like these always found a way to surface later, when masks fell and truth refused to stay buried. His phone buzzed. Text from Harland. "Legal. Arrived at site. Ready when you are." He typed back one word. 5. There was still time. 5 minutes was what he had promised himself to observe, absorb and test the temperature of the environment he'd now own. The receptionist remained on her phone, occasionally typing between chews of gum. Above her head hung a bold vision board filled with corporate phrases: diversity, community, synergy, all pasted over stock images of handshakes between multiracial teams. At the center was a slogan in big block letters: "Diversity makes us stronger." The irony made his jaw tighten. He inhaled through his nose, exhaled slowly. A door to the left opened, and 2 HR staff exited, deep in conversation. One, a white woman with glasses, made momentary eye contact with Winston, before quickly looking away. The other, a man, glanced at him, paused, then leaned in to whisper something to his colleague. They both shared a brief smirk. Not one person had asked his name. Another 2 minutes passed. The receptionist received a call, answered with a bright, performative voice, then hung up and resumed scrolling. She never once looked his way. Winston's eyes scanned the room. The firm was modern, filled with glass, metal, and the illusion of transparency. But like so many places, it had a selective gaze. He turned slightly, catching a glimpse of a young black woman sitting alone at a far desk. Her nameplate read, "Aisha B., intern." Their eyes met for a split second. She started to rise, her expression flickering with recognition. But then one of the HR staff from earlier appeared beside her and whispered something. Aisha sat back down, her eyes downcast. Her voice had been silenced before it was even used. Winston tapped his watch. It was time. He stood slowly, deliberately. The sound of the bench creaking caught the receptionist's attention. She looked up, confused for the first time. He walked to the desk, leaned in slightly, and locked eyes with her. Gone was the polite distance. What remained was wait. "Tell them Mr. Gray is ready now." The receptionist blinked. "I'm sorry, Mr. Who?" "Winston Gray," he said, not raising his voice. "The one your company just sold itself to." Her mouth parted slightly, as if forming an apology but not yet willing to believe she needed one. Behind her, The break room laughter had gone silent. One of the employees had stepped into the hallway, mid-coffee sip, now frozen in place. Winston looked past her toward the conference room doors. Inside that room sat a group of executives, unaware that their futures had just been bought, and were now about to be reckoned with. The receptionist stammered, reaching for the phone with shaking fingers. I didn't know. You didn't ask, Winston said, and turned toward the hallway. As Winston reached for the handle of the conference room door, it suddenly opened from the inside. A voice said smugly, "Sorry, this room's for executives only." Winston stepped through the threshold anyway, his voice like steel. "Exactly why I'm here." The moment Winston stepped through the conference room doors, the air shifted. 12 executives sat around a polished mahogany table, half-eaten pastries and lukewarm coffee scattered among stacks of printouts and iPads. Talk had been light, a Monday morning ritual of stock updates, minor grievances, and safe gossip. The moment he crossed the threshold, silence sliced through the chatter. No one recognized him. No one expected him. His stride was unhurried, deliberate, each step echoing against a high ceiling like a ticking clock. The head of the table, the CEO's chair, stood empty, symbolic in its vacancy. Winston paused for half a second, then pulled it out and sat down, his posture regal and unapologetic. Eyes darted. One woman, auburn hair pulled into a tight bun, leaned toward the man next to her and whispered, "Who is he?" A man in a slim gray suit, with a too-polished smile, responded with a chuckle. Maybe he got lost on his way to building maintenance. Winston didn't flinch. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a slim black folder. Gold letters stamped into the leather read, "Transfer of power." He set it gently on the table, opened it with precision, and flipped the document around so the room could see. His voice was calm and low, but it filled the space. "These are the final acquisition papers, signed, notarized, executed as of 7 a.m. this morning." Confusion twisted into unease. The room froze. "No," murmured the woman in the bun. "That's not possible." From the far end of the table, a voice broke the growing tension. Smooth, smug, with the kind of entitlement that only years of unchecked authority could nurture. Douglas Kent, CEO for the past 11 years. Tall, broad-shouldered, and still wearing a casual smirk like it was part of his wardrobe. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded. "You're joking, right? Who let you in here?" Winston met his gaze, unblinking. "I let myself in. I own the building." A wave of stunned silence crashed through the room. Winston turned another page in the folder and slid it across the table. The cover bore the Colton Technologies logo, but the letterhead read Gray Equity Ventures. "I'm the man who now owns this company," he said evenly, "and you, Mr. Kent, are terminated, effective immediately." No one moved. No one spoke. The words didn't land like a blow. They landed like a verdict, like something long coming, sealed in fate and forged in patience. Douglas looked around, searching for allies. But their eyes were shifting, some toward Winston, others down at their laps. Even the corporate counsel, Marlene Cartwright, blanched and adjusted her glasses. You can't just fire me. I built this place. It's legal, it's binding, and it's already filed with the SEC. The tension in the room became unbearable, like air sucked from a sealed chamber. That's when the receptionist burst in. Her face was pale, hands trembling slightly, as if gravity had finally betrayed her. She looked around the room, then saw Winston. The recognition dawned in a slow, shameful burn. "I'm Mr. Gray. I didn't know," she began. Winston turned, his expression unreadable. "You didn't care to ask." Her mouth fell open. The room, now deadly silent, absorbed her humiliation. "You may want to start packing too," Winston added. "This meeting's gonna get uncomfortable." She backed away, nodding slowly, unable to hold eye contact with anyone in the room. She disappeared as quickly as she had entered. Douglas, red-faced and flustered, pointed a finger across the table. "You can't do this. My board—"
"Your board sold you out,"
Winston cut in. "Because while you were busy playing politics and padding executive bonuses, the company's value sank.
"Your diversity metrics were a joke. Your culture? Toxic."
Your internal audit reports, I've read every page." He pulled a USB from his jacket pocket and inserted it into the conference room's console. With a few taps on the remote, the large screen at the far end of the room flickered to life. Footage played, grainy at first, then sharp. The lobby. Winston sitting silently on the bench. the receptionist ignoring him, the break room laughter, and most damning of all, the executives passing by, glancing at him, and walking away without a word. The faces in the room began to shift from confusion to recognition to horror. "That's this morning?" one of them whispered. "Yes," Winston said. "Every corporate space I enter has surveillance. It's not for security. It's for accountability." The man in the gray suit, who had earlier joked about building maintenance, turned white. "I didn't mean anything by it." "But you said it," Winston interrupted, his voice still composed. "And not a single person corrected you." The screen paused on the moment. Aisha, the black intern, began to rise, only to be stopped by HR. Winston turned to the woman responsible, seated at the table, now shrinking in her leather chair. That intern had more sense and integrity than this entire room. No one responded. "You all sat in meetings, approved campaigns, celebrating diversity, published reports on inclusion, and yet when a black man in a suit walked in, your first instinct was to assume he didn't belong." Douglas cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "This feels personal." "It is," Winston said. "But not in the way you think. This isn't revenge. It's reclamation." Then, with a quiet click, he advanced the footage one more time. A hidden angle now showed audio murmured jokes, whispered slurs, smirking glances. One voice said, "Black folks sure love to overdress." Another chimed in, "What do you think he's selling? Herbalife?" It was all there. Raw, unfiltered, documented. The room became suffocating. Reputations cracked under the weight of exposure. "Ladies and gentlemen," Winston said, turning off the screen, "what you just witnessed is your culture, not my opinion. You have two choices: accountability or exit." Chairs shifted. Some employees began scribbling notes. Others stared blankly. Douglas looked like a man watching his empire burn, but too proud to scream. Winston leaned back in the CEO's chair once more, fully at home now. He reached into his folder again and pulled out another document. As he unfolded it, he said quietly, "Before we continue, you should know this isn't the only footage I have." The stillness in the conference room thickened as Winston unfolded the second document, then set it aside. His fingers moved with intention as he clicked the remote once more. The screen came to life again. "I told you," he said quietly, his voice sharp enough to cut glass, "that there was more footage." And then it played. The same lobby, same bench, same morning. But this time, the footage zoomed in on the break room hallway, angled just enough to catch the group of staff members standing behind the frosted glass divider. The camera had picked up more than just smirks and eye rolls. It had captured audio. Clear, gutting audio. A man's voice, identifiable now, snorted, "You see him? Probably here to drive someone's Benz around back." Another laughed. "Nah, DoorDash for sure. My Cobb salad's late." A woman giggled. "Why are they always overdressed? Like the suit makes you less invisible." No one objected. Not one person had said, "That's inappropriate," or even shifted uncomfortably. The laughter was smooth, easy, normalized. The camera cut to the front desk. The receptionist casually texting, never once making eye contact with Winston. And then the shift. The angle now pointed subtly toward the corner desk. Aisha's desk, the intern. Her brown skin and bright eyes had peeked over the divider when Winston entered. She stood, hesitated, clearly uncertain. Her instincts told her to greet him, to offer respect where none was being given. But before she could move, a middle-aged white man, Mr. Harold, senior HR advisor, appeared at her side. He placed a hand on her shoulder and murmured something inaudible. Her eyes lowered, her spine curled slightly. She sat down and didn't look up again. The footage didn't need to explain what was said. The intent was clear: stay in your lane. In the conference room, Aisha now sat in the far corner, as silent as she had been in the footage. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. Winston glanced at her, not with pity, but with a recognition that came from living the same moment too many times to count. The footage shifted again. This time, it was from 2 weeks earlier. A boardroom meeting. The diversity and inclusion session. The same executives were seated around the table. Animated, performative. Douglas Kent was speaking, voice full of empty conviction. "We are committed to growing a culture of equity and visibility. Every voice matters, and we celebrate perspectives from all backgrounds." Claps followed. Then a voice, now clearly identified as Marlene Cartwright, added, "We have implemented mandatory unconscious bias training, and quarterly community outreach to underserved groups. The irony turned acid, because every face around that table, the same ones who had just laughed about a black man in the lobby, were nodding, smiling, congratulating themselves. When the screen finally went black, silence descended like judgment. No one dared to look up. Winston stood slowly. He didn't need a podium. His presence was enough. "I didn't need a tour of your software architecture," he said. "I didn't need to meet your directors or read your code repositories. What I needed to understand before signing that dotted line was who I was investing in." He walked the length of the table, eyes scanning every face. "And what I saw," he continued, "was a culture built on coded language, exclusion, and polite complicity. What I saw was a system so confident in its own self-righteousness, it no longer cared how transparent its bias had become." No one interrupted. His words came with the weight of experience, with the tone of a man who'd seen too much and learned never to flinch. "There are those who cracked jokes," he said, eyes narrowing on a few executives, "and those who stayed silent." He turned toward the gray-suited man who had first mocked him. "And then there are those who laughed loudest," he said. "You, Mr. Anderson, made a career out of subtle sabotage. You hide behind humor, but make no mistake, your words were weapons." Anderson shifted in his seat, suddenly unable to breathe comfortably. Winston pivoted, walking slowly, intentionally, to face Marlene. "You're the legal backbone of this company. And yet when you watched your peers mock a man based on skin and assumption, you stayed silent. Because complicity," he said, voice steady, "is comfort with injustice." Aisha's breath hitched. Winston's eyes finally met hers. He didn't call her out. He didn't need to. His gaze offered solidarity, not spotlight. Some in the room began murmuring apologies. Quiet, frantic, rehearsed. Marlene whispered, "I'm deeply sorry. I didn't know it would come across that way." "I'm not looking for apologies," Winston said sharply. "I'm looking for accountability." The words settled like a verdict. Douglas finally spoke, rising to his feet again, trying to reclaim control. "You came in here like a wrecking ball. You've humiliated us. You've thrown your weight around." Winston turned, unflinching. "You humiliated yourselves. I just pressed play." Douglas took a step forward. "You could have handled this quietly, privately." Winston nodded slowly, then said with lethal softness, "And let the culture fester, unseen. I didn't buy this company to inherit your silence." Douglas's mouth opened, then closed again. He had no rebuttal. Not today. Winston took his seat once more at the head of the table. The room was quiet enough to hear the hum of the HVAC system overhead. He opened a leather folder, removed a list of names, and laid it on the table. "These are the individuals being placed under immediate review," he said. "Some of you will be terminated today. Others will face conditional reassignment pending investigation." Marlene reached for the list. Her name was at the top. Her hands shook. "This isn't personal," Winston said. "This is structural." Murmurs rippled. The self-righteous arrogance had drained from the room. All that remained was shame, fear, and uncertainty. And then his final words. Winston looked at the room with unflinching resolve and said, "Your names are already on my list." He paused, "But this isn't the real reckoning." Without another word, Winston tapped the remote again, this time queuing up footage from a private Slack channel labeled, "Off the Record, Exec Chat." The screen flickered, loading the next layer of betrayal. The screen faded to black again, leaving behind a silence that buzzed with panic. The footage of the private Slack thread had revealed a side of the company no public-facing statement ever had. Laced with sarcasm, racial stereotyping, and elitist disdain, the messages floated on-screen in time-stamped horror. "We should install a separate elevator just for HR hires. They always come in with their DEI baggage. That intern in finance. Total DEI token. If this new investor turns out to be one of those equity activists, I'm out." And now he was in. Winston didn't need to yell. He didn't raise a single decibel as he stood again, but the finality in his tone could have split glass. "I've seen enough," he said. "And so have all of you." He turned to the screen, now black, and clicked the remote one last time. The room's smart system recognized the command, displaying the names and job titles of 5 individuals. Winston stepped aside, letting their shame cast its own spotlight. "Effective immediately," he said. "These 5 employees are terminated for conduct unbecoming, racial hostility, and systemic sabotage of the values this company pretends to uphold." Gasps echoed. Some hands flew to mouths. A few turned pale, especially the receptionist's name at the top. Jenna Lively, front desk supervisor. Her door badge access had already been revoked. Her email, disabled. Winston had coordinated it in advance with the new IT lead. She stood at the back of the room, frozen in place, face drained of all the arrogance she'd once carried so confidently. Two more names followed. James Harrow, VP of Client Accounts. Kelsey Miners, VP of Marketing. James's smirk evaporated in an instant. Kelsey's eyes filled with tears, not of remorse but shock at being held accountable for what she'd always hidden behind jokes. The other two, Robert Cho, Director of Engineering, and Debbie Trask, HR lead, shared the same look of disbelief, as if they'd been untouchable for so long, they'd forgotten consequences even existed. Security entered the room, not with handcuffs or aggression, but with quiet authority. One by one, the five were asked to step outside. Bags would be delivered to them. Their departure was not up for debate. Whispers slithered through the air like static electricity. The rest of the staff sat stiff, eyes darting, calculating their own exposure. Winston walked to the head of the table once more, but this time he didn't sit. Instead, the side door opened, and in walked five new figures. All black, all dressed in a mixture of executive minimalism and proud identity. Afro-textured hair, patterned ties, polished shoes, confidence not drawn from ego, but earned through fire. Winston raised a hand. There was Dr. Simone Rayner, VP of Strategy, formerly pushed out of a Fortune 100 company after accusing a senior partner of racial gatekeeping. Then Marcus Fields, CTO, a tech genius who'd once been asked to fetch coffee at a conference where he was the keynote speaker. Beside him stood Nia Tompkins, CCO, once denied a promotion 3 times because she didn't fit the team culture. Derek Lane, head of operations, who had left a promising firm after being called well-spoken one too many times. And finally, Vanessa Jordan, incoming head of people and culture, a former whistleblower who had exposed wage disparities between white and black staff at her last job. Derek said, "They saw my skin before my resume. Now they'll see results before resistance." Simone added, "I was once told to tone down my truth. Now I build policies that turn truth into standard." The executives who remained seated shrank under the weight of contrast. Winston took the floor again. This company built its brand on innovation, yet buried talent under bias. It wore the mask of equity while rewarding sameness. That ends today. A few hands rose, desperate pleas in disguise. Winston didn't blink, but it was. He scanned the room once more. You wore loyalty like camouflage. You passed off inaction as neutrality. But when injustice is comfortable, silence is betrayal. Suddenly a voice cracked from the back of the room. It was Jake Young, white, junior developer. Nervous, thin, and known for barely speaking in meetings. His hand trembled as he stood. I heard the comments," he said, voice cracking. "When you came in, I heard the Uber joke, the snickering, and I said nothing. I just put my headphones in." Everyone turned to him. He swallowed hard, eyes locked on the floor. "I wanted to speak up," he whispered. "But I didn't want to lose my place. I didn't want to make waves. I thought maybe it wasn't my place." He looked up at Winston. "I'm sorry, not because I got caught in it, but because I kept breathing while others were suffocating." For a moment the air shifted again. Not absolution but pause. Winston walked toward Jake slowly. The room held its breath. "You didn't throw the stone," Winston said softly, "but you watched them aim. That makes you a witness. And now, maybe, a student." Jake's eyes brimmed with something real. Shame and possibility intertwined. Winston added, "I don't reward silence, but I do recognize growth." He turned back to the room. "Some of you will have a chance to stay, but it won't be based on tenure, titles, or friendships. It'll be based on action. From today forward." The room was hushed. People began scribbling notes, not out of fear but uncertainty. The corporate walls that had once felt unshakable were cracking at their foundation. Then, as if on cue, someone's phone buzzed. Then another, and another. A wave of murmurs spread. Winston stepped aside as one of the staff members pulled out their phone. Their face turned pale. "Sir," the man stammered. "The footage. It's online." Winston blinked. "What footage?" "The lobby footage. The comments. The Slack messages. Someone leaked it." Winston raised an eyebrow. "Already?" Ajisha, across the room, instinctively opened her phone. Her hands trembled as she saw the hashtags exploding. Winston Gray, CEO, while black, fired them all. Reckoning in tech. Views were climbing by the thousands per second. Winston turned to the screen behind him, which now flickered with an incoming alert from the company's official Twitter handle. Someone inside had shared it from the verified account. The story was public. The company wasn't just dealing with internal reckoning anymore. The world was watching. Winston walked to the window and looked down at the street below. Already a small crowd had gathered outside the building, and among them, someone held a sign that read, "He's not done yet." By the time the sun dipped behind the skyline that evening, the clip had already passed 5 million views. It had started on a small Reddit thread. Someone claiming to be a witness to corporate karma uploaded a low-res screen capture of the lobby footage. With the caption, "They told the black CEO to wait outside. He owned the building." The story traveled faster than wildfire in dry wind. Within hours, TikTok creators had spliced the footage with reaction videos. Twitter trended globally under hashtags like CEO while black, told to wait, fired them all. Winston Gray was right. Every social platform became a battlefield of opinions. On one side were voices cheering the poetic justice. Black professionals, DEI advocates, students, and even celebrities praising Winston's unapologetic leadership. Memes spread like wildfire. Winston adjusting his cufflinks at the receptionist desk became an instant symbol of quiet power. On the other side, pundits and conservative commentators cried foul. One Fox News headline read, "Hostile takeover or racial revenge. CEO sparks national debate on reverse discrimination." A popular YouTube personality labeled Winston a dangerous symbol of racialized vengeance, masquerading as justice. That video alone racked up 1.3 million views in 12 hours. CNN, MSNBC, even BBC and Al Jazeera reached out for interviews. Requests poured in by the minute from 60 Minutes to The Daily Show. Winston declined them all. No press statements. No prepared remarks. No PR spin. His silence became a statement in itself. People speculated. Is he afraid? Is he calculating? Is he planning something even bigger? What the public didn't see were the emails that clogged the company's servers. Hate mail flooded in, subject lines laced with racial slurs, threats, and pseudo-legal language. Go back to where you came from. You don't deserve that seat. You're ruining the fabric of real American business. Its security flagged several messages as credible threats. One anonymous email contained aerial photos of Winston's home. But there was another tied, quieter yet just as powerful. Resume. Dozens of qualified black professionals began applying to Colton Technologies. Engineers, designers, marketing directors, all writing cover letters that began with variations of, "I saw what you did, I want it." One even wrote, "This is the first time I've ever applied to a job where I felt I might actually be seen." HR had to open a separate inbox just to manage the volume. Outside the office, the crowd grew. What started as a few curious bystanders ballooned into a full-blown protest. One side held signs that read, "Black excellence, Naas racial vengeance." Others showed up in solidarity, their placards painted with Winston's face beside the words,
"Leadership looks like this."
"He did what had to be done." Some came to chant. Some came to scream. And Winston? He walked past them every morning, calm as ever. Black coat, steel briefcase, impeccable suit. The boardroom remained a tense environment. Even those who hadn't been fired walked on eggshells. Whispers filled the hallways, fear mixed with self-preservation. People who had once mocked DI efforts now downloaded books on anti-racism. LinkedIn bios updated overnight with words like ally, advocate, inclusive. But Winston wasn't watching LinkedIn. He was watching behaviors, and he noticed everything. Anonymous emails began trickling in. Messages from staff who hadn't spoken up during the lobby incident, but now wanted to leak apologies. Internal memos, Slack messages. A few even confessed to previous cover-ups in HR files, hoping Winston would offer mercy in exchange for confession. It didn't move him. He built this entire play not for retribution, but for exposure. A cafe down the street even launched a new menu item. The Winston Latte. Bold, black, unapologetically strong. He didn't care for the fame. He cared for the ripple. And the ripple was turning into a wave. His assistant had left for the night. He opened the email. Subject: formal notice of lawsuit. Douglas Kent versus Winston Gray, Colton Technology.
There it was. The fired CEO had finally made his move.
Winston opened the attached file. 43 pages of legal jargon, accusations and bold claims. Fired without cause, racially motivated termination, professional defamation, psychological trauma resulting in loss of future income. The phrase that stood out most: an act of racial retaliation disguised as reform. Winston leaned back in his chair, fingers interlocked, jaw steady. And worse, Douglas hadn't filed it alone. The lawsuit dropped like a hammer, but Winston didn't flinch. Across newsrooms, law firms and social platforms, headlines lit up like sirens. Is reverse racism real? In a televised interview, Douglas sat stiffly in a dark suit, face lined with performative sorrow. His voice trembled just enough for effect. I was removed not for incompetence, but for color, he said. In a world obsessed with optics, I became the casualty of a narrative that needed a villain. Conservative pundits leapt to his defense. Talk shows debated whether reverse discrimination had become the new threat. Hashtags like Justice for Kent and Equal means everyone began trending. Though notably, they trended only in specific circles. Winston watched all of it unfold from his glass office. Face unreadable. He didn't hold press conferences. He didn't release counterstatements. He prepared his truth, brick by brick. Behind closed doors, Winston's legal team met daily. At the center of the effort was Patrice Duval, his lead counsel, an Ivy League-trained black woman with a reputation for dismantling corporations with surgical grace. She wasn't interested in statements. She was interested in proof. And Winston had proof. Receipts. Documents that outlined years of misconduct under Douglas's leadership. 3 separate HR complaints filed by black employees, ignored or buried. And most damning, internal memos advising the former executive team to avoid diversity hires for senior roles unless legally pressured. In a private team briefing, Winston spoke with calm conviction. I'm not interested in optics, I'm interested in accountability, he said. Let them argue in headlines. We'll win in silence. But silence didn't mean passivity. Add Damon C. Dev. I worked at Colton for 3 years, got passed over for promotion twice. The white guy they chose instead asked me how to spell algorithm. I Texas 77. When I asked HR why no black women were in leadership, I was told to focus on my personal growth and stop looking for problems. The tide began to turn. What had started as a lawsuit became a spotlight on the company's past. News outlets that had once painted Winston as radical began shifting tone. Investigative reports revealed wage disparities, biased hiring practices, and a culture that prized performative inclusion over structural change. Douglas's public image, once carefully curated, began to crack. Photos emerged of him at a private fundraiser with political donors known for anti-immigration rhetoric. A leaked audio recording caught him joking about needing less color in marketing. Even his supporters began to distance themselves. Winston watched it all without glee. It wasn't victory, it was excavation of truth, of systems, of rot buried beneath polished corporate surfaces. And yet he knew better than to grow complacent. No return address, she said, setting it on his desk. There was no explanation, no context. But Winston understood what it meant. It was about every system that had ever let a man like Douglas rise. This lawsuit was more than legal. It was political, cultural, generational. It was a warning that power never cedes quietly, not when it's forced to look in the mirror. The mole was real, but the message in the envelope suggested something more. This wasn't just sabotage. Winston stood at the window of his office, staring out at the city. Below, the crowd had shifted, smaller now, but sharper. Some faces he recognized from weeks prior, others new. They watched him, monitored, measured. He didn't flinch. He reached for his phone, tapped open his encrypted contacts, and selected a name he hadn't used in years. The line rang. A voice on the other end picked up. Didn't think I'd hear from you again, it said. I need your help, Winston replied. They've started playing dirty. There was a pause. Then it's time we clean house. That night, surveillance picked up a figure entering the building after hours. Badge access approved. They headed straight to the compliance archives. When security reviewed the footage, the person was wearing a Colton Technologies VP badge. The mole wasn't just close, they were in the room. Winston had never walked through metal detectors to get to his own office until now. Within 24 hours of the cryptic note, they won't let you win. Security protocols were overhauled. Motion sensor cameras were installed across the executive floor. Background checks were re-verified. and all badge access was narrowed to essential personnel only. But paranoia didn't drive Winston. Pattern recognition did. He knew threats like these never came alone. They always arrived in waves. First whispers, then sabotage, then open hostility. The corporate world was just another battlefield, dressed in blazers and coded language. He stood silently at the security desk one morning, reviewing new visitor logs, when his assistant approached, pale and shaking. Winston moved quickly.
Know your place.
You people don't belong here. Next time, stay seated. Her hands trembled as she held her phone to document it. But her eyes brimmed with tears she refused to let fall. Winston approached carefully. He didn't speak immediately, just stood beside her, reading the graffiti in silence. Finally, he said softly, "You okay?" "No," Aisha replied, her voice cracking. "But I'm staying." That broke something in him. Not because she was fragile, but because she was still brave enough to be visible. "I'll have this cleaned," he said, "but not before everyone sees it." Aisha hesitated, eyes wide, but then slowly, she nodded. Okay. Later that afternoon, Winston called a private meeting. No press, no optics, no corporate buzzwords. Just truth. The room held 20 people, senior leaders, rising managers, and the new leadership team he'd brought in. Aisha was there too. He stood before them, sleeves rolled, no tie. "This is no longer just a company," he said. "It's a battlefront." The room stayed still. "What we're fighting isn't limited to racism," he continued. "It's about systems, resistance to change, the kind of hatred that wears suits and hides behind policy." He held up a photo of the vandalized locker. "This isn't a prank. This is a warning. And it won't be the last." That night, his prediction came true. At 2:03 a.m., the servers crashed. All of them. The internal network went dark. Project timelines disappeared. Client data vanished. Code repositories, financial reports, infrastructure blueprints, all inaccessible. The IT team worked through the night, and by sunrise they confirmed it. A deliberate cyber attack. Route trace led them back to a disgruntled former employee. Wes Connors, a senior systems engineer who'd been fired during Winston's second week for insubordination and racist conduct in the company Slack. At the time, Wes had smirked during his exit interview and said, "This place won't last long under your kind of leadership." Now, he was in custody. Police found external hard drives, company schematics, and a list of staff names marked with red flags. A digital hit list. Winston was at the police precinct within hours. He didn't make statements to the press. He didn't scowl for cameras. He asked one question. Did he work alone? The detective hesitated. "We're not sure yet. There are encrypted messages on his devices. There may be a network." By mid-afternoon, the media had caught up. Headlines shifted from admiration to alarm. Black CEO faces violent backlash after corporate shakeup. Cyber sabotage at Colton. Retaliation or revolution. Employee terror plot uncovered amid diversity uprising. Winston scanned them with detached precision. He wasn't surprised. The moment a black man became more than a symbol, when he wielded real authority, there was always an attempt to redefine him as a threat. But this time, the threats weren't symbolic. By evening, his phone buzzed with a silent alert from the private security firm he'd hired. The message was simple. Your home address was posted on a dark web forum. He read it twice. No emotion crossed his face. He closed his laptop, rose from his chair, and walked to the window of his office. The city lights blinked below, millions of lives unaware of how close change had come, and how violently the system fought to repel it. He picked up his phone, called his wife. "Pack a bag," he said. "You and the kids need to leave the house tonight." She didn't argue. She'd known this was coming. As he ended the call, a knock came at his office door. It was Aisha again, this time holding a printout. "We found something else," she said, her voice low. Wiz wasn't working alone. She handed him the file. Inside were email headers, anonymous aliases traced to IP addresses inside the building. Someone on the current payroll had coordinated the timing of the attack. They weren't just trying to ruin him. They were trying to erase the work entirely. Aisha hesitated at the door, then turned back. "There's one more thing," she said. "The IP, it was traced to your executive floor, the one with restricted access." The overnight bag sat on the front steps, zipped and waiting, while Winston stood in the hallway staring at the family photo hanging crooked on the wall. His wife Denise, their two sons, all smiling on a beach vacation from a life that now felt 1,000 miles away. But as she reached the door, she turned to face him. "Is it worth it?" she asked. Winston held her gaze. His jaw was tight. "Yes." Her eyes didn't blink. "Even if we lose the normal life we built." Winston looked away for a second, just long enough to remember how they used to walk through parks without fear, how the boys used to run barefoot on summer lawns without security detail. "Especially if we lose the illusion of safety built on silence," he said. Denise kissed his cheek without another word, and stepped into the car. The door shut, the engine pulled away, and Winston was alone again. He returned to his office that night, city lights reflecting off the high-rise windows like a constellation of pressure points. He stared out, but his mind wasn't on skylines. It was on a memory he hadn't touched in years. He was 16, dressed in his only suit navy blue, borrowed from his uncle for a job interview at a local law firm. He'd gotten the address wrong and entered through the service entrance by accident. Within minutes, 2 police officers had him against the wall, hands behind his back, knees pressed into concrete. He kept repeating, "I'm here for an interview." They didn't believe him until the white receptionist came out, wide-eyed and horrified. Even then, one officer said, "Next time, use the front like everyone else." Winston carried that memory like a scar beneath his suit. He never spoke of it. He never forgot it. Now standing in a glass-walled office that bore his name, he whispered to himself, "I survived that. I'll survive this." The next morning, Aisha nearly resigned. She walked into Winston's office with her badge in her hand, and her letter folded in half. "They vandalized my car," she said quietly. "They slashed the tires, and left a copy of my internship acceptance letter under the wiper." Winston took the paper, read it in silence, and then placed it gently on the table. "If you walk now," he said, "they win twice." Aisha's voice wavered. "I'm scared." "I know," Winston replied, "and you should be, but fear means you're not numb. That's not weakness. That's a signal you're still human." She stood frozen for a long moment. Then slowly she took her badge back. That afternoon, Winston elevated her. He made her director of outreach, a new department meant to connect the company with local black colleges and tech training programs. Aisha was the first intern in the company's history to join the executive team. She cried in the elevator, but only after the doors closed. 2 days later, Winston received a visit from an old mentor, Reverend Elijah Matthews, a retired civil rights leader who once marched with John Lewis and outlived too many battles to count. Elijah walked slowly now, cane tapping against the tile, but his mind was still sharp as a blade. His gray eyes saw through posture, through smiles, through armor. They sat in Winston's office over coffee. Neither of them touched. "You think you're winning?" Elijah asked. "I think I'm exposing." Elijah nodded slowly. "You're also painting a target, and the deeper you dig, the more you uncover bones others swore were buried for good." Winston didn't respond. Elijah leaned forward, voice quiet but weighty. "They kill dreams like yours in boardrooms," he said. "Not with bullets, with silence, with isolation, with fear that makes you resign yourself, not your title." "That's what I'm afraid of," Elijah whispered. The building was nearly empty, except for 2 cleaning staff and the overnight security guard. He walked into his private office, shutting the door behind him, exhaling. He loosened his tie, stretched his arms, and sat behind his desk. And then he heard it. A faint click, not loud, but distinct, almost like a button being pressed. He froze. He stood up slowly and scanned the room. Nothing appeared out of place at first glance, but years of instinct told him what most would miss. He began to search. Taped beneath the ceramic base, no larger than a thumb drive, was a micro-recording device. Red light blinking slowly. Winston stared at it, unmoving. It had been recording, in this office, likely for days. Every strategy session, every confidential conversation, every plan for legal, structural, and social change. Compromise. As Winston examined the device, his office lights flickered, then cut out completely. His phone buzzed with a single message from an unknown number. "We hear everything." The power outage lasted only 6 minutes, but in that time, the building's illusion of security cracked. Lights flickered, server rooms auto-shut down, and backup systems kicked in with an audible hum like a mechanical exhale. Winston remained in the dark, both literally and strategically. The message on his phone, "We hear everything," wasn't just a warning. It was a taunt. By the following morning, His office was swarming with internal security and digital forensic analysts. Every wire, outlet, panel, and digital access point was under inspection. But how? Only one employee on the HR team matched those timestamps. Maribel Stroud, 26, junior assistant in HR. Soft-spoken, always early, never made waves, hired 9 months ago. She was the kind of employee no one ever noticed, which is exactly how she stayed invisible. She'd accessed his office. She'd planted the device. The question was why? Instead of having security drag her in, Winston sent for her himself. They met in the small glass conference room known as the Ledge, a name the staff joked about for its location overlooking the 25th floor. But today, it lived up to its name in more ways than one. Maribel sat across from Winston, fidgeting with the hem of her cardigan. Her eyes darted toward the frosted glass as if expecting to see handcuffs or accusations coming through it. Winston, however, didn't speak for a full 30 seconds. He just watched her. Finally, he said, "I'm not here to embarrass you. I'm here to understand." Maribel's fingers stilled. Her shoulders sagged. I didn't mean to," she started, voice cracking. "You placed a recording device in my office," Winston said softly. "Let's not pretend this was accidental." Her lips trembled. "They said if I didn't, they'd ruin me." "Who?" She swallowed hard. Her voice was barely a whisper. "The Sentinel Group." Winston blinked slowly. That name wasn't unfamiliar. The Sentinel Group was a so-called whistleblower watchdog. But its record told another story. Anonymous leaks, weaponized audits, coordinated smear campaigns. It had a documented pattern of targeting minority-led startups and non-profit organizations that leaned into social equity work. Their funding was shadowy, their ties political, and their tactics brutal. "Why would they come to you?" Winston asked. "Because they knew I had access," Maribel said. "I worked in HR. I saw how they were watching you. They said I could help expose corruption, that you were hiding money, that you were trying to tank the company for social justice points. And you believed them?" Winston leaned back in his chair. His breath was even, but inside his stomach turned. This wasn't about her. It was about access. She was disposable to them. A pawn dressed up as a patriot. "Do you have anything in writing?" he asked. "Emails? Texts? Proof?" Winston nodded. She slid the phone across the table. "I'm sorry. I really am." They'd been preparing for this moment, baiting failure, betting on the backlash, ready to weaponize it. The final straw came 3 hours later, when the Sentinel Group published an official press release on their website. Public Watchdog announces independent investigation into Winston Gray's prior ventures. They claim to have received multiple credible tips, alleging financial mismanagement, ethical breaches, and identity politics fueled corporate manipulation. The article made waves instantly. Cable news picked it up. Conservative commentators cheered. Moderates questioned. Shareholders panicked. The press release even included screenshots from Winston's old consulting firm emails. Slightly edited, taken out of context but damning when read without nuance. Winston read it all in silence. Then he turned to Patrice. "They want to erase my credibility before I even get to the courtroom. They're betting public trust collapses faster than legal defense," she said. "They're betting wrong." But even as he spoke the words, Winston knew the walls were closing in. Not just on his reputation, but on the infrastructure he'd fought to build. This wasn't a lawsuit anymore. It was a war on legitimacy. The next morning, Winston received an alert. His oldest company, a mentorship nonprofit he'd founded in his 20s, was being subpoenaed for a federal audit. The first file requested its list of black donors. The subpoena hit like a gut punch. Winston stared at the header from the Federal Audit Division. Request for financial transparency. The Horizon Initiative. His first company. His first love. He had founded the Horizon Initiative in his 20s, a mentorship nonprofit designed to support young black boys navigating underfunded schools and systemic bias. Back then, he'd used his savings to rent church basements and run weekend programs with borrowed laptops and volunteer tutors. And now, they were auditing it. Not for fraud, not for misuse of funds, but for its donor list. Specifically, black donors. That wasn't just oversight. It was intimidation. Winston forwarded the subpoena to Patrice and walked away from his desk. He didn't need legal interpretation. He knew exactly what this meant. They weren't digging for truth. They were digging for doubt. That same week, Headlines from conservative-leaning outlets began surfacing stories with bold, pointed language. Winston Gray's nonprofit raised eyebrows over political ties. Ex-board member claims discomfort over Gray's rhetoric. Old contracts, new questions. Did Winston Gray mix business with advocacy? The sources were thin, the stories thinner, but truth had little defense once public curiosity took the wheel. One article cited an anonymous source who claimed Winston had once discouraged white participation in an equity roundtable, a lie Winston knew exactly how to refute, because that roundtable had been filmed, and 2 of the 3 speakers were white. Still, the damage was done. Social media took the bait. Hashtags splintered. Supporters were drowned out by bots and baiters. News clips cut and rearranged his past speeches to sound radical, even hostile. A video of him saying, "We have to dismantle privilege," was clipped just short of the next line, in order to make room for justice. Meanwhile, Winston's team went on offense. A separate team of researchers, data scientists, and digital sleuths dug into the Sentinel group's funding structure, and what they found wasn't just revealing, it was incendiary. Several of the watchdog group's largest anonymous donations had been funneled through shell accounts tied to competing tech firms. One of them, Trident Core, had been a direct competitor in a government contract Winston had won 6 months ago. Another donor was a lobbying firm, with a long, shady history of fighting diversity bills on Capitol Hill. And worse, there was evidence the Sentinel Group had paid consulting fees to 2 former Colton Technologies board members. Names Winston hadn't expected to see again. It was all there, right beneath the surface. Corruption wearing the mask of accountability. Enough was enough. On a rainy Thursday morning, Winston stood at the podium of a packed press conference. It was his first public statement since the lawsuit. He wore no tie. His eyes were clear. His voice, unwavering. "I've remained silent long enough," he began. "Not because I was unsure, but because I believed the work would speak louder than the noise." He held up the federal subpoena in one hand. "They're not investigating fraud. They're investigating who supported me, who believed in me. And what they're really asking is, how dare they?" Flashes popped from cameras. A hush fell over the crowd. "I am not the first black man to build something powerful and be accused of stealing it. I am not the first to be told I don't belong at a table. I constructed, but this," he tapped the subpoena. "This is not about corruption. It's about suppression." He leaned forward. "Racism is no longer shouted from rooftops," he said, voice rising. "It's whispered in spreadsheets, hidden in audits, disguised as policy. It comes dressed in professionalism, but fueled by prejudice." That sentence cracked through the room like thunder. Within minutes it trended globally. Whispers in spreadsheets, Winston's speech. This is what systemic looks like. The press conference ended without a single question taken. Winston walked off stage, and the silence he left behind was louder than any answer he could have given. That evening, as his team reviewed their next steps, legal filings, protective strategies, and digital risk assessment, Winston's private email pinged. An encrypted message. No name. No greeting. Just a subject line. "I'm inside. I can help." He opened it carefully. Inside was a single paragraph. "I work for the Sentinel Group. I have access to internal communications. They're planning something bigger far beyond the lawsuit. Leaks. Blackmail. Campaign donations. They've tied your name to foreign funding. None of it's real. But they plan to release it." Winston stared at the screen. Below the paragraph was an attachment. A zip file labeled Echo Protocol Draft 1 by. His hands hovered over the keyboard. He picked up his phone. "Patrice," he said calmly. "We just got our first defector." Before Patrice could respond, another message arrived, this time from the same source. It read, "They know I sent this. If I go dark, assume they've buried me. The real file isn't digital. It's in a safety deposit box. I'll send the key if I make it out." The envelope arrived 3 days later, hand-delivered to a private P.O. box Winston hadn't used in years. It came wrapped in plain brown paper, sealed with tape, and marked only with a single phrase written in black Sharpie. "The real war was never about you." Inside was a safety deposit key. But Winston already knew what it unlocked. He and Patrice traveled in silence to a nondescript credit union on the outskirts of the city. They used a back entrance. No press, no attention, just tension thick enough to suffocate. The flash drive was encrypted beyond standard military-grade protocols. It took Winston's team 72 hours to break through the layers. The files were precise, well-organized, and damning. Inside, internal email chains between Sentinel Group executives planning reputational destabilization campaigns against over 30 black-owned companies in tech, education, media, and energy. Communications with lobbyists, advising how to fund low-profile lawsuits to cripple progress under the guise of corporate ethics. A master list of anonymous donors, many of whom led or sat on boards of major competitors, including firms Winston had once applied to for investment and had been quietly rejected by. But it wasn't just business. One folder, ominously titled Echo Protocol, contained slideshows and scripts to be fed to select media outlets. The language was chilling. Frame as instability, not discrimination. Tie race-conscious leadership to market volatility. Control the story before the truth arrives. The final document was a memo dated nearly a year before Winston ever set foot in Colton Technologies. Subject, WG, Preemptive Containment Strategy. They had been preparing for him long before he became CEO. Patrice's hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through the documents. They didn't just come after you, she said quietly. They plan to erase the next decade of black equity in business. Winston didn't speak for several minutes. His thoughts weren't on himself anymore. They were on the names on that list. Young founders he'd met at conferences, women building healthcare apps, teachers launching tech in low-income schools, investors who had already risked everything. He couldn't stay silent now. Not even for strategy. Within 48 hours, Winston met with a group of trusted investigative journalists, blacklisted reporters, award winners, and whistleblower defenders. He handed them the entire cash. This isn't about me anymore, he said. It's about the machine they built, and who they built it to destroy. The expose went live the next morning. Inside the network built to sabotage black success in business. Documents reveal how Watchdog Group targets minority-led companies. The price of equity. Leaked memos show corporate sabotage in plain view. The nation erupted. Cable news lost its mind. Social media went thermonuclear. Think pieces, op-eds, and live panels consumed every hour. Senators tweeted demands for answers. Governors issued statements. Students protested. CEOs who had once remained silent finally spoke. The Sentinel Group released a hasty statement denying the authenticity of the files, calling them fabricated, selectively edited, and politically motivated. But it was too late. The Department of Justice launched an inquiry. Subpoenas rained down. Internal servers were seized. Whistleblower protections were granted to employees still inside the group. Within days, 3 Sentinel board members resigned. One issued a public apology. But the fallout wasn't over. Because among the documents, hidden in a subfolder marked Tier 1 stakeholders, was a name that sent shockwaves through both political parties. Senator Langston Pike, a 3-term U.S. Senator, former Attorney General, and the current frontrunner in the upcoming presidential election. Emails linked him to strategic meetings with Sentinel leadership. In one, he was quoted saying, "We need to keep the narrative controlled. Minority expansion is a public relations trend, not a structural shift." That line was underlined, highlighted, dated, and sent directly to Sentinel's executive team, 2 weeks before they launched a digital smear campaign against another black-owned energy startup in Louisiana. The moment his name was verified and cross-referenced, the leak was confirmed by multiple outlets. News anchors scrambled to cover it live. Winston stood in his office, silent, as the image of Senator Pike's face flashed across every major screen. Not as a leader, but as a conspirator. Patrice turned to him. "You just shifted the entire race," she said. Winston didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He only said, "Good. Maybe now they'll stop calling this an overreaction." As the dust from the leak settled, Winston received a private call from a blocked number. The voice on the other end was familiar. It said, "You're not the only one with files, Winston, and I just sold mine." By the time the trial began, the courthouse stood at the end of a 6-block-long media blockade. Satellite vans snarled traffic, reporter stands dotted the sidewalks, and live shot crews painted the grand pillars with color-coded chaos. Protesters across the street held placards, chanting. They clustered into 2 camps. On one side, marchers raised signs, reading, "Justice for Winston. Power isn't revenge, it's repair. He built it. You called him Uber." Opposite, challengers bore their own banners. "Reverse racism is still racism. Corporate hostility in the name of equity. Merit over melanin." This wasn't just a trial. It had become a national gut check. The rotunda had turned into a microcosm of America, divided, uncertain, every face carrying their own version of hope or anger. Inside, Winston walked through the security checkpoint with unmistakable gravity. No tie, charcoal suit. Calm. He moved like he'd rehearsed silence more than rhetoric. Aisha followed, dressed in all black, eyes steady, presence unshakable. She had transformed overnight from intern to symbol. Douglas Kent made his entrance soon after, eyes pale, face composed but betrayed by the tremor in his clenched jaw. His legal team flanked him, looking all the more fragile in their attempts at confident posture. The prosecution went first. They laid out a narrative of corporate misconduct, wrongful termination, sabotage, and obstruction of regulatory process. They argued Douglas had been ousted not for performance, but because a black CEO needed scapegoats, and used race as justification. The defense presented a counter-narrative. Winston had weaponized race, they asserted, creating a totalitarian corporate culture that punished whiteness. They labeled Douglas a casualty of emotional optics, not racial hatred. "We are confronting a case of overcorrection wrapped in virtue signaling," one attorney claimed, earnestly. "Firing 5 white executives in one day, without transparency or review, is inherently discriminatory." That line was meant to land as logic, but its real weight landed cold, where the jury could see it. Then came Aisha. She rose to stand at the podium with quiet strength. Her hands didn't shake, her gaze didn't drift. She recounted that morning, where Winston sat outside the door on the bench, ignored by strangers who assumed service. She told the court about the sideways glances, the jokes, the chilling silence that enforced invisibility in a company that claimed inclusivity. "We weren't seen," she said, voice firm. "Not until he made them look." Her delivery was emotional but measured. She spoke of how black professionals had been trained not to expect respect, only tolerance. About coded comments hidden behind laughter. About diversity metrics posted, but never. "Leadership told us we mattered." But it was all optics until Winston entered the room. Her final words bent the courtroom air. "He didn't give me confidence. He gave me visibility." The public gallery stirred. Silence carried in the courtroom. Heavy, charged. When Winston took the stand, he carried no notes, no prompts. Every eye in the room pivoted toward him. "I didn't set out to become a symbol," he began. "I came to lead." He described stepping through the lobby that first day, not welcomed, but assumed servitude.
"I wasn't given the job, I reclaimed it."
He spoke with clarity and pause. When talent bleeds out of places fearful of change, it's not just skill being lost, it's truth. He told the jury about the stark contrast between brands of diversity, one that's performative and one that demands structural rearrangement. He touched on the thousands of resumes from capable black professionals, on the legacy of stigmatized exclusion built by petty biases. "I didn't ruin Douglas Kent," he said, quiet but firm. "I just stopped cleaning up his mess." Emotional yet disciplined, his words reframed the whole story, from bias and blame to redefinition and reclamation. Prosecution closed with this declaration: "This case is not about hurt feelings. It's about structural harm systems built on exclusion, where a man rose to power and dismantled the compromised scaffolding." They called Winston's actions corrective, necessary, restorative, not punitive. They framed his firing decisions as provisional, not vindictive, asking the jury to weigh character and pattern, not reaction. The defense responded by urging caution. "In seeking to restore balance, we must not fall into imbalance." They appealed to fear of overreach, warning the jury that Winston's brand of leadership risked turning justice into exclusion, turning redress into retribution. The narrative was now bifurcated: restoration or reversal, safety or overcorrection. The jury, 8 women, 4 men, a racial mix, 3 black, 5 white, 2 Latino, 2 Asian, retired for 6 hours. Across the hall, America held its breath. Live push alerts pinged every 5 minutes. Offices broke routine to watch streams. College classrooms paused. Social media exploded with stream of consciousness commentary. Allies debating, critics trembling, moderates confused. At his desk inside the judge's chambers, Winston sat beside Aisha. His hands folded, his eyes steady, her shoulders were squared, solid in solidarity. The judge re-entered. The jury filed back in, faces neutral, envelope in hand. The 4-person stood and began. "In the matter of Douglas Kent versus Colton Technologies and Winston Gray, But before the verdict was read, a hush turned frantic. A bailiff burst in with an official-looking envelope. He whispered to the judge. Papers exchanged hands. The judge's eyes flickered. "Your Honor," he said, nearly breathless. "This just came from the clerk's office." The judge gave a tense nod. Winston's jaw tensed. Aisha's breath hitched. The judge cleared her throat. "There is evidence which has never been entered into the court record," she announced, voice quiet but rigid. "The court has received exculpatory documents that must be reviewed before reading the verdict." Utter shock rippled through the room. Cameras flashed. Spectators gasped. Douglas shifted in his seat, one eyebrow raised, eyes narrowing. The judge held the jury's gaze. "We recess for 20 minutes. This evidence must be examined." Chaos erupted. Lawyers rushed forward. Court officers murmured. A quick side announcement to press crews. New evidence delay. Outside the courtroom, headlines blinked live.
Verdict delayed, last-minute evidence rocks Kent trial.
Court halts reading mid-judgment over new document. Winston Gray trial stalls. As hidden file emerges, inside, Winston and his legal team were ushered into a back chamber. A sealed file lay waiting. Unlabeled. Ominous. He looked at Patrice. She cradled her phone, trembling. He exhaled slowly. Let's see what they tried to hide. And as they opened the envelope together, the courtroom doors slammed shut. The verdict and the fate of this battle hung in limbo. By the time the final jury deliberated, the courthouse parking lots were filled beyond capacity. Spillover crowds lining surrounding blocks. Satellite trucks snarled Manhattan traffic. Reporters took positions on bleachers outside. And protest stations formed a sea of banners and placards. Groups waved slogans of support. Justice for Winston. Black excellence nails corporate sabotage. He built it. They let him wait. Opposing them stood others demanding equity. Reversed. Reverse racism is still racism. Merit not melanin. Corporate hostility dressed as diversity. The scene had become a national referendum, not just on a man, but on who gets respect, who owns leadership, and what accountability looks like. Inside the packed courtroom, the judge called the session to order. First, the prosecution laid out a case, unafraid of weighty terms. Corporate fraud, wrongful termination, sabotage, defamation. They portrayed Douglas Kent not as a failed CEO, but as a powerful insider who resisted equity until he was forced to face up. The prosecution's opening lines painted Winston's rise as inevitable, an overdue rise of integrity. They argued that Winston had documented proof that Douglas and his allies actively concealed misconduct, marginalized talent of color, and patented the company culture on exclusion. The defense countered with precision. Winston, they argued, had weaponized race, tearing into legacy systems without due diligence. They claimed Douglas was the victim of emotional optics, not racial animus. One attorney said, "We are witnessing an overcorrection, wrapped in moral privilege." They painted the firing of 5 employees in one afternoon as sweeping and disproportionate, suggesting Winston prioritized symbolism over process. The tension between justice and overreach was set in black and white. Then came Aisha. Her presence alone shifted the atmosphere. No longer the background intern, she stood at the witness box with quiet confidence. She described in measured tones that first morning, the lobby bench where Winston sat, ignored beneath the watchful eyes of HR, where jokes about Uber and DoorDash masked deeper contempt. "We weren't visible," she testified. "Not until he made them look." Her words were concise, but carried emotional weight. She spoke of silenced ambition and institutional invisibility, how she had been trained not to speak up, only to survive. She described diversity metrics as hollow gestures, birthed in boardrooms but dissipated in culture. "Until he gave me visibility, I was practice noticed, not person noticed," she said. The courtroom fell quiet. Cameras zoomed. Notes rustled. Media interpreted her calm testimony as undeniable truth. When Winston ascended to the stand, he carried no notes. He needed none. Cameras and viewers leaned forward. "I didn't intend to become a symbol," he began. "I came to lead." He retold walking through the lobby, uninvited but not unwelcome. Except, of course, he was unwelcome. That moment stayed etched in memory. He spoke of the thousands of black professionals who'd learned to hide their brilliance, and how he turned that invisibility into expectation. "Talent doesn't stay where it's ignored," he said. "Diversity doesn't thrive if walls remain built on perpetuated ignorance." He spoke of resignation, not giving up, but forcing space. Every firing I authorized, he said, was not vengeance. It was reclamation. His testimony was calm, yet fiery, pain folded into strategy, and narrative braided into accountability. Prosecution closed on a sharp note. This isn't a case about hurt feelings. It's a structure-crumbling moment, a legacy of inequality challenged, a system under unchecked echo. They pressed the jury to consider institutional harm, systemic patterns, and long-concealed manipulation. Balance mustn't become backlash. Equitable leadership doesn't require rewriting history by erasure. They cautioned the jury against moral expediency and called for restraint, asking, should one man's leadership rewrite decades of professional balance? Now, the fate of justice or derailment rested with 12 strangers. Post-closing, jurors retreated. Deliberation began at 11:13 a.m. Hours crept by. Outside, live feeds updated constantly. Every 5-minute flash brought fresh analysis from newsrooms. Social media exploded with speculation. Supporters chanting, "We believed him when no one else would," while critics questioned equity gone wrong. Winston remained within the judge's chamber, seated beside Aisha. They posed only silence and computation, waiting for narrative to turn verdict. In the matter of Douglas Kent versus Colton Technologies and Winston Gray, but as the initial words were spoken, a sudden hush turned chaotic. A mountain of silence crashed when a bailiff burst in, envelope in hand, addressed to the judge. He delivered it urgently. The judge looked to it, eyes widening. She announced, "The court has received previously undisclosed evidence. Exculpatory material not entered into record. We will recess for 20 minutes, so this may be reviewed." Gasps reverberated. Lawyers rushed. Spectators craned. Media flashed new bulletins. Verdict stopped. Hidden evidence emerges. Surprise document postpones Kent verdict. Inside, Winston's legal team was ushered into a side chamber. Awaiting them was a sealed envelope, unmarked, possibly containing his fate. He looked at Patrice. She stared back, tension thick, heart tapping beneath her stern exterior.
They exhaled.
And in that sense of freezing pause, their battle was still alive. "Let's see what they tried to hide," Winston whispered to Patrice. When the jury returned after recess, their faces set, deliberate, final. The air snapped. The foreperson read again. "We find the defendant, Douglas Kent, guilty of wrongful termination under false pretenses. We find defendant guilty of corporate fraud, including misappropriation of funds. We find defendant guilty of malicious interference with post-acquisition operations." Silence for a heartbeat, then a thunder in realization. Winston's posture remained firm, expression unmoved. Across the aisle, Douglas's shoulders slumped. His defense attorneys looked defeated. For Kent, the empire built under arrogance collapsed with the clarity of law. The judge offered a brief sentiment. "This court recognizes that equity succeeded over entitlement. No fanfare, just the strength of precedent." Winston exited alongside Aisha, stepping into media glare. Cameras fiercely captured the moment, but he stepped forward only long enough to issue a single statement. "This isn't a victory, it's a mirror. Look in it." His restraint elevated him. It reframed the story. It pushed the issue beyond him, into every boardroom meeting reflection. Black CEOs and professionals, many silent till then, rose. Their posts, speeches, interviews echoed newfound boldness. A tech founder tweeted, "Winston took the hit so we could speak truth into power. Now we speak." Another wrote, "They couldn't see us until he sat at their table. Now they must." Colton Technologies' momentum reversed. Investors, applicants, partners recognized the narrative wasn't risk. It was revelation. Within a week, Winston introduced the Black Catalyst Fund, a $50 million initiative investing in Black-led startups in education, healthcare, and tech equity. Boardroom Rewired, a corporate transparency policy requiring every acquisition partner to undergo equity audits and inclusive hiring protocols. Aisha was named Director of Strategic Equity, the first intern elevated to permanent C-level, the first executive hire made to signal transformation. Morale soared. Applications flooded. LinkedIn posts celebrated systemic reformation, embracing sustainability and inclusion. Change didn't quell backlash. It inflamed it. Edited clips circulated darkly, reshaping Winston's words to fit hostile frames. Hate mail returned, worse this time, threatening his family, painting him as a public enemy to certain networks. One message declared, "You think you've won? Real wars don't end in court. They end in shadows." Winston didn't react publicly. Privately, he increased security, deployed deeper cyber protocols, reviewed personal risk assessments. Still, he worried, not for himself, but for staff who now stood alongside him. On Thursday morning, as Winston approached the headquarters plaza, he noticed an unusually tense crowd. Security surrounded him knowingly. Within seconds, whispers spread. The massive LED display on the building facade had changed, unscheduled. In bright red letters,
This isn't over.
the message held no hashtag, no signature, just defiance. Security fanned out. The message wasn't internal. A malicious external node had accessed marketing credentials, tied to one of Winston's early terminated executives. Inside the office, Winston watched video playback. The message scrolled, ominous, direct. Aisha stood by him. "They're not planning to win, boss," she said softly. "They're attempting to wear you down." He nodded, lips pressed. "Then we simply outlast them." Moments later, an all-staff alert pinged phones. "Your leader lied. Proof drops at midnight." The message came from an unknown sender. Blank address. It was the lowest, the darkest escalation. Inside Colton, executives paused. Staff whispered, fear mixed with curiosity. Winston stared at the message. Eyes narrowed, teeth clenched just slightly. He turned to Aisha. "What do they have next?" In response, his phone buzzed again. An encrypted tracking code. A file location. It read simply, "You wanted proof. Here's what they buried." Midnight. He exhaled once. The hours until darkness would now decide everything. And the uprising had only just begun. The office was unusually quiet for a Friday morning. After the late-night message, "Your leader lied. Proof drops at midnight." Everyone arrived early, eyes on their screens, hearts thumping beneath their work attire. Winston entered through the executive elevator, escorted by 2 security officers, nodding silently at familiar faces. His expression was unreadable, but his mind was already working 3 moves ahead. He knew the message wasn't just a threat, it was bait. The only question was what was on the hook. Aisha met him at the top floor, eyes bloodshot but focused. She hadn't gone home. She hadn't even taken off her blazer. "They tried something last night," she said without preamble. "Real damage. Almost worked." Winston blinked. "Go on." "Someone ran a purge command on the company's legal archive, access logs, employment records, financial records, linked to the acquisition. If I hadn't cross-checked the redundancy schedules, it would have all been gone." A breath caught in Winston's chest, though he didn't show it. "How much was lost?" "Nothing," she said, smiling faintly. "We stopped it 2 minutes before the kill command finished." "Who did it?" he asked. "We locked the building after the attempt. Everyone inside is still here." He traced the access point to the 2nd floor. "We think we know who. HR's running a quiet protocol now." They took the side staircase, no need to alert anyone else, and arrived at a nondescript office, tucked beside the design lab. Inside sat Eric Densley, mid-30s, white, wiry, a systems analyst who had been spared in the original staff overhaul. He had kept a low profile for months, never commented on the headlines, never posted online, but in silence it turns out, he'd been harboring resentment. Aisha held up a printout of the access logs. Eric's eyes widened. "I didn't look, I just..." Eric swallowed, hands trembling. "I didn't mean to delete everything. Just scare you. You humiliated my mentor. You embarrassed this company. Everyone talks about progress like it's supposed to erase loyalty." Winston's tone was even. Progress doesn't erase loyalty. Loyalty to dysfunction erases progress. Eric's face crumpled. "I thought I could scare you back into the shadows." "And now?" Winston asked. Eric looked down at his lap. "Now I see you didn't come from shadows. You were just made to sit in them." Winston motioned for Aisha to leave the room briefly. When the door closed, he sat beside Eric, not across from him, beside him. Eric blinked. "What do you mean?" "You give me names. People who helped you. People who are still trying to tear this down from the inside. Full list. Full context. And in exchange, we don't prosecute. We reintegrate. If you're serious about change, you'll help us finish cleaning house." Eric broke. Tears spilled, not because of fear, but because the mirror was finally being held up to him. He began naming names. 2 project leads, 1 board advisor, and a contracted financial consultant who had funneled sensitive documents to Sentinel Group affiliates. The rot went deeper than Winston had imagined. What he had thought was sabotage from outside had also grown quietly, virally, from within. As the day wore on, the company stabilized. Staff moved quietly, respectfully. There was a different weight in the air. Not fear, not panic, something else. Reckoning. That afternoon, Winston returned to his office, exhausted but centered. He sat down at his desk for the first time in hours, letting the tension unravel from his spine. Aisha entered moments later. "We cleared it," she said. "The network is stable. The backups are intact. No more surprises for now." He nodded slowly. "I never thought it'd take this much," he said. She sat across from him, not as an employee but as an equal. "Rebuilding always does," she replied. "But you did more than rebuild. You forced the foundation to shift." Just then, Winston's phone buzzed. A blocked number. He picked it up instinctively, pressing the speaker button, allowing Aisha to hear. "Mr. Gray?" a voice asked. Male. Older. Official. "Yes. This is James Hadley, Deputy Secretary for the Department of Commerce. You're receiving this call on a secure line." Winston's eyebrows furrowed. "I'm listening. We've been following the Colton case closely, and your recent work to expose systemic business suppression. Your leadership, well, let's just say, it's turned heads where it matters." Winston didn't speak. "We'd like to nominate you for appointment to the Federal Business Equity Commission. It's an advisory group forming this fall, designed to investigate bias in capital access, procurement, and board recruitment across the private sector. You'd serve as chair." Winston leaned back in his seat. Yasha's eyes widened slightly. The voice continued. "You don't have to answer now, but we'll send the offer packet by courier today. We need leaders who've survived the fight and still want to teach others how to win it."
The call ended.
Winston didn't move for a long while. He stared at the ceiling, not in disbelief, but in calculation. He turned to Aisha. "You ever think," he asked softly, "that sitting on a bench could lead to testifying in federal court, then to changing national policy?" She smiled. "No. But you made us all stop sitting." They didn't laugh, but something light cracked through the weight of the day. Then the building lights flickered, just once, like a final petty aftershock from the systems they had finally exercised. As Winston prepared to leave for the day, his assistant knocked gently and handed him a manila envelope just delivered by courier. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed unsigned. "Turn down the nomination, or we release what we found on your father." He had sat alone, staring out the office window, the cityscape a living mosaic of ambition, betrayal and hope. Aisha, though curious, didn't press. She had learned by now. Winston wasn't built to run from ghosts. He hunted them. That night, he didn't go home. Earl had known the man before the fall. Before Prism. Before whispers replaced his name. "What did they find?" he asked. Earl didn't pretend to be surprised. He reached for a folder he'd kept for decades. Inside were clippings, news articles, court transcripts, internal memos from the 1980s. Winston's father, a rising logistics executive at a major shipping company, had been framed for embezzlement. The real culprit, a white executive whose father sat on the board. But instead of fighting, his father had pleaded guilty. Quietly. With shame. "Why didn't he clear his name?" Winston asked. Earl leaned forward. "He knew they'd come for you next. So he gave them what they wanted. Silence. Because if they buried him, they wouldn't bury you." That moment broke something in Winston, and rebuilt something stronger. Winston returned to Colton headquarters the next morning, with purpose carved into every step. He called the Department of Commerce. "I accept the nomination," he said. "But only on one condition." Silence on the other end. They hesitated. He didn't. 3 weeks later, under bipartisan pressure and national attention, the Corporate Equity Oversight Act passed through Congress. And history reshaping. Under Winston's leadership, the commission audited 30 Fortune 500 companies in its first year. 11 were found to have significant patterns of racial wage suppression and exclusion from promotions. Fines were issued, CEOs were ousted, stockholders rebelled not at equity, but at exposure. He didn't stop there. He required tech companies receiving federal contracts to meet diversity thresholds. Not quotas but pipelines. Not metrics but outcomes. For the first time, equity became enforceable. One rainy afternoon, Winston returned to the high school he once attended, Roosevelt South Tech Academy. The same place where, decades earlier, he'd been asked to leave the lobby because career day was only for invited professionals. This time, he walked into the gymnasium not as a student, but as a legend. Hundreds of black and brown students watched from the bleachers, some still in uniforms, some wearing hoodies and dreams. Winston stood at the mic. No suit, no notes. They once told me to wait outside, he said softly, pausing for effect. So I built the inside. He shared his journey. The lobby, the courtroom, the betrayal, the rebuilding, the triumph. But most of all, he shared his father's story, not as shame, but as sacrifice. A young girl in the front row whispered, "He looks like us." Winston caught it and smiled. Back at Colton Technologies, another legacy was being written. Aisha, now in her late 20s, was unanimously promoted to Vice President of Innovation Strategy, the youngest in company history. Under her, Colton launched mentorship initiatives with HBCUs, started coding camps in underserved cities, and developed the Equitech Accelerator, a startup incubator for minority-owned tech ventures. Winston opened the door, she told one interviewer. I just refused to let it close behind me. By its 5th year under Black-led leadership, Colton Technologies had become one of the largest minority-led firms in the country, not just in name, but in board representation, employee equity stakes, and culture transformation. Inside the main lobby, the one where it all began, Winston installed a new digital display. It read simply, "Power belongs to the patient." It was more than a slogan. It was a philosophy, a response to every moment someone had tried to erase, silence, or delay his journey. On that same day, Winston returned to the same exact bench where he once sat, dismissed as a driver. But this time, he didn't sit. Instead, he stood near the entrance as a young black boy, maybe 15, walked nervously through the revolving doors in a too-big blazer and wide eyes. The receptionist smiled, stood, and extended a hand. "Welcome, sir. How can I help you?" The boy blinked. He looked back, confused, as if the greeting wasn't meant for him. But it was. Winston watched, quietly, his face unreadable, his chest heavy, not with pride, but with peace. The boy was escorted to the mentorship tour. As the camera pulled back, the building's new motto illuminated in warm gold letters above them. Power belongs to the patient. It wasn't just a statement, it was prophecy fulfilled. But as the scene faded into dusk, across the street from Colton's glass tower, a man leaned against a dark SUV, watching, unmoving, no phone, no notes, just observation. He wore a charcoal coat, face obscured by shadow, but a flash of silver on his wrist, an old watch Winston once gave to a colleague who disappeared after the Sentinel leak. He lit a cigarette, watched the boy enter, watched Winston exhale, and smiled, just faintly. He wasn't done. No one should have to earn their humanity just to be seen. Winston's story isn't rare, it's just rarely recorded. If you've ever been overlooked, underestimated, or erased for how you look, you already know how this feels. Type yes if you believe silence is no longer an option.